I'm sure if you are watching this, you probably have a good understanding of what process safety is, but just so we're all on the same page, Dave, do you want to give kind of your definition of process safety and take it away?
I would say, yeah, so there's process safety or there's personal safety, or that's probably what most people regard as safety. So personal safety looks at more about, the accidents that are related to individuals. Your like slips, trips and falls, they are far more likely to happen, but they're far less consequence. Whereas process safety is what we all do to prevent major accidents, your fires and explosions, your big ship impacts and things like that. They are, fortunately, much lower likelihood, but much higher consequence. So although they've both got safety in them, they're actually very different. And what we do to prevent process safety and personal safety incidents is actually hugely different as well. And quite a lot of what we do for process safety to prevent it is invisible, it's less obvious, and it's a lot more difficult. You've got to be a bit more creative. There are a few things that overlap, potentially like the culture and working practices of some companies, but they're two very distinct things. And yeah, at Salus, we focus a lot more on process safety. Yeah.
Is it true that everyone, regardless of whether you're a safety professional, so to speak, or not, is it true that everyone plays a role in process safety?
Yeah, and I think that more than ever, and the more work we do, the like more I continue to think that, yeah, everyone does have a role. That's, a lot of people might think it's the safety team, it's the HSE team, or it's the people that are out there on the like front line at the work site. But it's everyone in between, whether it's supply chain, ordering the like components of right specification, it's HR getting the right people in, training and competency, right through to senior management, that really set the agenda, the working practices, the budgets, the allowable time. So everyone's got a role to play. And almost every single major accident that's ever happened, there was like more than one thing went wrong, and lots of those involved management decisions or the actions of people who worked in an office who you might not have thought, were involved, in like process safety. So everyone's got a role to play. I think everyone should at least have an awareness of process safety. If you work in a major hazard industry, doesn't mean that you have to be an expert in it, but you have to know where you fit in the grand scheme of things. And I certainly think that all leaders as well, there's a certain level of competence I think that they all must have, just to really understand like how the impact of their decisions might actually impact process safety in ways that might not be obvious.
So obviously we're talking about a huge topic, very broad, covers all aspects of a business, it sounds like. Where could an organization start if they were looking to improve their process safety performance?
Yeah, I mean, like that might depend on where the organization is, like on its like journey, but where most probably are, I'd say starting at the top, starting with your leaders and working your like way like down. As like said before, there's lots of things that can be done and they don't realize that they can have a massive impact both positively and negatively. So I'd say, start with your leaders, make sure that they understand, like major accident risk, make sure they understand what the company does to like prevent process safety incidents, make sure that they're all talking the same language, that's consistent, and then that will start to filter its way like down, because we all look up to our leaders, whether we realize it or not, and we mimic their behavior in like lots of ways. So if they make it clear that authentically that process safety is important to them, then like their like reports and their reports, etc., are like going to start doing the like same. So yeah, I'd say start at the like top, but equally, the people out on the work site that are dealing with the like risk, for the opposite reasons, they also need, to have that competence, to have that awareness, how to work safely, but also when to, like stop the job and say, no, actually, I don't think this is safe, or I think we've circumvented this important process. So I'd certainly say start at either end and start to, work your way in.
I hear you mention ORAs often. What does that stand for, and what exactly are they?
I do find I say the word ORA almost every single day. So an ORA stands for Operational Risk Assessment. It goes by lots of other names, but really in offshore oil and gas and some other major hazard industries, that is the like risk assessment that you do when you've got some safety critical equipment that's impaired. A really good analogy that someone else used, but I'm going to recycle, is they've talked about if you're driving your car. So say that you're driving your car down the motorway and the speedo on the car like brakes. So you don't know how fast you're going. Everything else still works, but you know that there's a car garage just like 5 minutes down the like road. You go, well, you could probably talk yourself into going, it's probably safe for me just to continue to drive. I might move to the inside lane. I'll stay behind that car in like front. You can safely get to the like garage. So that's you like continuing to operate with a slight impairment, maybe making some slight changes to try and bring your risk like back down. But say the exact same scenario, but your brakes failed. You know, you're probably going to want to just pull over straight away and call the A and get that fixed. Driving 5 miles down a motorway with no brakes is probably not a safe thing to like do. So ORA is the exercise in understanding what your impairment is, understanding how it connects to other impairments and other things that you're doing, and deciding what's the right thing to do. Do we continue to operate? Do we operate in a different way? Or do we stop the operation entirely? And it's a really difficult thing to do. You know, process safety is really complicated. There's loads of complex relationships between things, and you know, you've got to assess the like risk of that impairment. We also tell people all the time to look at cumulative risk. What's the risk? You know, cumulative, all the impairments and all the other things that are going on. That can be very hard as well. So you need like a multidisciplined team to sit and go through everything methodically and really like challenge yourselves. What is the right forward action? You know, ORA, some people might say or might view it as an exercise, and we do a risk assessment to justify keeping going, when, you know, you should always go into these things with the attitude of, you know, right, you know, we're not going to continue unless we can make a case for continuing. And there's loads of like regulations and practices and standards around ORA. You know, you've got to be a multidisciplinary team. It's got to involve senior management. You've got to make that demonstration about cumulative risk. And certainly in like late life oil and gas, there's a thing called the bathtub curve of risk. So that means like risk is like high to begin with, then it comes down like a bath, and then for a sustained period, you've got a lower, not low, but a lower risk. But as you start to go towards late life, things start to break, or you're extending the life of things, or you're squeezing your resources, risk starts to increase. So you're coming back up the other side of the bath. So quite a lot of oil and gas assets certainly are coming back up that bathtub curve of risk. So tools like ORA are becoming even more prominent. So, you know, it's an area that we do quite a lot. We do a lot of training on, help write procedures and stuff. And it's really important that like things like that are done properly. So you make the right risk-based decision, and that you can demonstrate going forward. Yeah, huge.
Can you talk about some of the challenges? I know you mentioned it's a really challenging process. Can you talk about some of the most common challenges and even misconceptions about ORAs?
Yeah, some of the misconceptions are like an ORA is a bad thing. I think culturally, traditionally, in some companies, if you had an ORA, it was seen as, oh, you know, you've like done something wrong. So people trying to make a case to not raise an ORA, oh, it's something else, oh, it's this, oh, it's like that. So I think the fact that you've got an ORA to discuss means that there's an impairment that you know about, and you're putting the like right team of people together to assess that and do the like right thing. So it's not, I wouldn't go too far to say that it's a good thing, but certainly if someone thinks that there's an impairment that warrants an ORA, I think that in itself, you know, is a like good thing. So, and also I think, I think by some it's maybe seen as a rubber stamp. We'll like do this and then we can just continue. So the first ever ORA that I went to, you know, I was told by my like boss, have the mindset that we're going to shut down unless someone can convince you otherwise. And even though there's some that you go to where you go, yeah, of course we're going to be able to continue, but having that mindset is like really like good. I think the other one is like the way that the UK safety regulations are set up. It's about you making a demonstration, you making your case for why you're safe, and quite often you'll get more scrutiny on what's not, on like what you're not doing. So, you know, there's a thing called a LARP, which is, you know, as low as reasonably practicable. It's shown that you've gone as far as you reasonably can. But to demonstrate that, you've got to say, well, here's all the stuff we looked at doing, but decided not to because. So I think that's an element that's missing, well, from lots of areas, but certainly from ORA. There's, you know, if I'm ever setting these things for review, I'm like, that'll sound sensible, but what else did you think about doing that you couldn't like do? So, you know, it's almost like, you know, an ORA should tell a story that anyone can pick it up and go, I see the impairment, I see the risks, I see what the team are like doing, and I see what they've decided not to like do. And I think the final one is like, well, there's maybe a few things here, is like, if the speedo on your car is broken and you decide, I'm going to just go to the inside lane and follow the car in front and I'll probably be okay. You probably will be okay, but that's not as safe as knowing the exact speed that your car's going. So any mitigation measure, any control that you put in place is likely not going to be as good as the actual, like piece of equipment that's impaired, or so you have to recognise that yes, you're doing things that might reduce the like risk, but you're going to be operating in a slightly elevated state of like risk. So when you get people to like do things, which is quite often, if a piece of equipment's broken, you might say, right, we'll get the control room operator to check this twice a day, or we'll get someone else to go out and inspect this. Actions that people take aren't as reliable often as safety critical equipment. So it's recognizing that. And if you're asking someone to do something, it might be every day, it might be every week. You have to make sure that that still gets done. So the ORA doesn't end when you're like done and press like send. You have to make sure that anything that you've committed to doing, you've got to keep doing. And that's a huge thing. And I think that the regulators recently commented on that, and we see that in letter items. It's like, this risk assessment's fine, we're actually happy, but you're not doing the things that you said that you're doing. So I think there's making sure that you've got the discipline to keep doing things like that.
And how do you ensure that the fixes aren't just temporary, but they're clear, actionable resolutions that will actually last?
Yeah, and like, an ORA, like a story that I just said, every story's got an ending, and it should say, this is what needs to be the case for this ORA to be closed. And it might be we fix the like impaired equipment, or we replace it with something else. And you have to be able to have like clear end date. And if you have to extend or revalidate, you have to make sure that goes under scrutiny as like, well, the action should absolutely be recorded so you can demonstrate that you're doing it. There's a huge requirement from the regulator to like monitor these things. So if there's like, regular, it might be weekly meetings where you go through all of the like actions and things like that. Are these still being done? Can we demonstrate that they're still being like done? So yeah, and that's an area that it seems like certainly from like, like new information being published by the regulator, that's only becoming under increased scrutiny. It was already under quite a lot of scrutiny quite often. When you get inspected by the regulator, they'll ask to see every single live ORA. But now it seems like that's something that will definitely happen like each time. So yeah, it's about that demonstration right from the start. Do we understand the impairment? Do we understand the cumulative risk? Can we demonstrate a LARP? And are we doing the things that we said that we're doing?
If an incident were ever to occur, how do you ensure that you actually get to the underlying cause of why that incident occurred, rather than just making a quick fix and moving on?
Yeah, and I think, and just like going back to ORA, these things all take time. Incidents shouldn't happen, but they do happen, and we should learn from them. But it takes a lot of time to do an incident investigation depending on what's happened. And as humans, we go right to the immediate cause of things that happen. And we do that in process safety. We do it in our personal life too. And it's like that person's fault. They did that. A really valuable incident investigation goes, right, fine, we understand the immediate cause. Most incidents are triggered at the work site, but they're caused by something that happened way like further up in the like chain, and often by someone in an office. So it's about establishing a timeline of the incident, establishing the barriers that should have prevented it but like didn't, understanding how they failed, and then really breaking down like why did that happen. Well, there's like quite a lot of techniques, but there's things like root cause analysis, 5 whys, is really asking why did that happen, but why did that happen, but why did that happen. And normally after 4 or 5 times you're like, oh my goodness, we haven't allocated enough time for this, we're not allocated enough budget for this. This procedure that we tell everyone to follow is not actually robust enough because we're not reviewing our procedures and things like that. So get right to the underlying cause. That can be really difficult and really painful. And, sometimes people might think, oh, that's maybe going a bit too far. But if you can investigate everything sufficiently that you get to the underlying cause or causes as to why that happened, that's an amazing opportunity to learn. You'll see these common threads coming through and go, oh my goodness, as an organization, we need to change X. I think when an incident happens, and even if someone has made a blatant mistake, just to stop and say, well, that person triggered the incident, end of, that's wasting a valuable opportunity to learn more and to help prevent the next one. So I really think that you should, fine, you can't do a thorough multi-week investigation for every single thing that happens, but you should have a clear threshold that an incident with a potential for something of like harm greater than X, we have to do this type of investigation. And you've got to, stick to like doing that, and that involves like giving the team time. I'm a trained incident investigator, and so many times I've been asked to like investigate something, and it's like, but you've only got like 2 days to do it, or you've got someone over your shoulder asking you for updates. So it's like, get a team with the right competencies, and get your safety representatives involved. and then let them do their thing. Give them time to breathe. Don't pester them. I was once offshore investigating a small fire that occurred with a piece of equipment, and the managing director of the company was also offshore and wanted to sit in on some of our interviews and things like that. I think that person was probably just interested, but we had to say no, let the team do their thing. So there's getting through that, but I think, and I've been very guilty of this, is you get to the underlying cause, you write a report, yes, we've really cracked it, but then there's what do you do with that? A 20-page report sitting on a shelf or going into the management system, doesn't do very much. An incident investigation report is just a piece of paper. What do you do with the learning? So we have to make sure that that's shared with all the relevant people, so they've got an opportunity to learn for the next time. So you see quite often people might make posters or one-pagers or put it in a slide, and that's all good. Let's keep doing that, but let's make sure that everyone gets to see that, and they might have to see it multiple times to really make it land. I once investigated an incident. Fortunately, there was nobody was hurt, but there was certainly potential. We presented it to management. We had actions. The actions got done. We made a one-pager as was required. And the next time I went offshore, 3 or 4 months later, people were I never heard anything about what happened, And I was oh, and then you chase it back and you go, yeah, actually, well, that's probably not the investigation team's responsibility, but the learning wasn't shared with everyone. And that's another one. There's getting to the root cause, but make sure that everyone understands what that is. So yeah, it's something I feel quite strongly about. And I think every organisation should have a really robust incident investigation process that makes sure that you learn from every incident to help prevent the next one from happening.
Yeah, I think effective communication is obviously key if you want to make any sort of change and ensure that something like that never happens again. Do we want to talk maybe a bit about HAZIDs and HAZOPs and what they are and what role they play?
Yeah, so it's something, I spend a lot of my time in them or facilitating them. So, and, hazard identification, HAZOP, hazard and operability study. These are, very common types of risk assessment. They involve a multidisciplinary team sitting around a table or all dialed in on Teams, and they go through, either a set of equipment or work process in a structured, methodical way. It's basically asking what can go wrong at each phase, and for each of those deviations or hazards, you're what could go wrong, what would the consequences be, and what controls, what safeguards, what barriers do we have in place to help prevent that from happening? But if it were to happen, how do we control and mitigate that? And there's lots of guide words that can be used for different applications to make sure that nothing's missed. But these are really effective. But my goodness, they're really time consuming. They're really difficult, and it certainly seems, in the last 10 years that everyone seems to have less time to allocate to these things. So quite often we're trying to squeeze so much in, to 1 day or a half day or things like that. So a really good HAZID or HAZOP is it's well planned. The information's all sent out in advance, so everyone's got time to do the pre-read. You've got a good quality scribe that can well capture the conversation. There's plenty of breaks. There's plenty of time allocated, so you're not trying to rush. And they can be quite rewarding. But yeah, they can be really difficult, challenging activities.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to bring up a word that everybody cringes when they hear now 4 years later. But can you talk about how the pandemic has affected these workshops, and if there are any long-lasting changes since COVID?
If you'd asked me in February 2020, could you do these things over Teams? I would probably have said, "What is Teams?" But could these be done remotely? I would have said, "No way." And obviously, there was no choice but to do that. So I still think it's much better face to face. But yeah, you can actually. I think that's one of the biggest changes is that people have figured out ways of doing these effectively remotely, which is good because it means that you can get maybe more of people's time or get somebody who wouldn't have been able to travel up and things like that. So that's probably the biggest change that I've seen is the use of remote sessions or hybrid sessions. It's massively changed. I'd say overall, probably not for the better. I still think you get a much better quality workshop when everyone's in the one room, because just like what I was saying, in other topics, there's the process of the risk assessment, but the values in the discussion. And that can be sometimes hard when you're sitting there and someone else is, you're looking at, a whole grid of people on a screen. But yeah, that's the biggest change I would say since the pandemic.
I know something about these workshops is there often or always is a scribe. Is that true? So to me, that just gives me immediate like typing anxiety, you know, when somebody's like looking over your shoulder and you immediately just like forget how to type. So how can people prepare to be a scribe, and what exactly does it entail?
Yeah, so traditionally, scribes are like younger professionals, younger engineers, process safety engineers. And I think scribing a workshop, although really hard, I had to do it when I was a younger engineer, but that's like the express elevator to like learning like loads. You're like in a room for days on end with experts talking about things, but it's also really hard. And I think a lot of scribes, there's a lot of things that you could do to better prepare. And I try and, do this, with our team that might scribe workshops for me. So the first one I would say is, do the pre-read. And if that's probably good advice for anyone, but, quite often a lot of documents are sent out beforehand and most people probably don't read them or they skim them, but the scribe should. The scribe should really understand all the acronyms, all the terminology, and probably once they've done the pre-read, ask the chair some like questions or things that are likely to come up. And I think with the scribe is, you need to sort of practice listening and typing. Different chairs have got different ways of doing things. I train my scribes just to, when in doubt, type what you think needs to be typed. I would much rather tell them to edit something that was already there than them just sit and wait for me to tell them what to do. But that's a really hard skill to learn. So there's practicing that. So maybe try and attend some workshops that you're not scribing, but why don't you just, especially if it's on Teams, why don't you just give it a go and try and see if you can scribe. I think some of the other stuff is, be an absolute beast in the software that's being used. Most of the time it's Word or Excel, but there's PHA Pro and all these kind of things. You should know all the keyboard shortcuts, all the tricks, for splitting rows, copying and pasting, adding new stuff in, that can really help speed the session along, because I think HAZOPs and HAZIDs are all about momentum. We actually use different sides of our brains for lots of the things that happen, like brainstorming or thinking of barriers and stuff. And if it's continual start, stop, waiting on the scribe catching up, that can actually kill the momentum of this session and can actually lower the value of the whole thing. So if you've got a scribe that's on it, it's well prepared, knows the software, knows the terms, it can have the opposite effect. I always say at the beginning to everyone, the scribe's the most important person in the room. So help them out if you see that they've maybe got something not quite right, and let's make sure it's them that's got to capture accurately what was discussed. But fantastic development opportunity as well, and it's good for scribes to work with different facilitators, different chair people. I've got my own way of doing things, but I know of other safety engineers that chair, they do things totally different from me and might ask more of scribes. So I think, scribe as many workshops as you can for as many different chairs as you can, and you'll probably be okay.
I believe safety cases is a word I hear all the time, and something that we have quite a bit of experience in. Not we, sorry, but we as a company. Can you tell me a bit about what they are and your experience?
Yes, so safety cases are the main requirement that you have to fulfill to meet the offshore safety case regulations. And essentially, and where those regulations come from, as it was comes from when the inquiry into Piper Alpha, and it was a barrister that led that. And if you think sort of in his experience, it's about the defence or the prosecution making their case. And it's all about that exact same thing. It's about a duty holder making their case that it's safe to operate the safety case. And, there's really big regulations. I think that the guidance document on the regulations is 160 pages, so there's a lot of things you have to do and include and fulfill, but it's ultimately you describing your installation, how you manage safety, what your risks are, what risk assessments that you've done, etc., etc. So it's a really big document. You've got to do special amendments to it if you're going to work with another installation to drill a well or to do something like that. There's also well notifications and notifications for special activities like decommissioning. So it's this massive, massive undertaking, and they become very big documents. But paradoxically, you've also got to engage your workforce in the safety case, which I don't know about you, but I've never been felt engaged in a 1,000-page document before. So companies come up with other innovative ways, like light safety cases or posters and slideshows and stuff. But ultimately for me, it's all about, you like write the safety case to satisfy the regulations, but you've got to make sure that the workforce understands what the major accident hazards are on your installation, how they're being managed, and what role that they need to play, and also what action is required of them in an emergency. And I think if you can fulfill that, then that's you getting people engaged with the safety case.
What are some big challenges related to safety cases that you are seeing in the industry right now?
I think, the fact that these are very large documents, they were written a long time ago when the asset was like brand new, and they've been, mended over time with changes and material changes. So there's keeping them accurate and up to date. As mentioned previously, we're on that bathtub curve of risk. So, it's a very dynamic situation where, changing might be changing how we operate things, how we manage things. There's loads of mergers and acquisitions with companies. You're, changing your whole working practices. We're accelerating towards decommissioning, so we might be taking some equipment out of service or putting new things in. So it's really been really challenging to keep these documents up to date, keep the workforce engaged. And in late life, there seems to be a lot more activity. So there's a lot more combined operations notifications or well notifications that are required to be sent in as part of the safety case. So there's loads of challenges coming up to do with safety cases. Just take a drink.
Excellent. Thank you.